Hello and welcome to News Center. With me, Parikshit Luthra. Boeing's India President Salil Gupte has called for greater capacity building to reduce reliance on imports. This comes after Civil Aviation Ministry called for curbing imports of aircraft, which had gone up by 56% in the first 6 months of this fiscal. In a conversation with CNBC TV18, Salil Gupte added that the government should reduce customs duties on MRO services. Listen in.
I would say that at this stage, India is in a huge part of its growth curve as we think about growth in civil aviation. It's already the third largest civil aviation market in the world. It already has one of the largest defense forces in the world and demand for defense given the geopolitical situation in the region. And so what you have to think about when it comes to India's self-reliance is how we grow capability in both manufacturing and services to meet the goals that the Commerce Ministry has outlined in its guidance over the last couple of days. And so I'll give you a few examples of how that can be achieved. One is on services. So a lot of the time we think about imports from a standpoint of manufactured goods, but there's also a lot of services that are imported by India. Just until recently, you had over 85% of maintenance, repair, and overhaul for Indian Airlines being done outside of India. And we believe that there's a huge opportunity to have that work done in India. And so we've set up the Boeing India Repair, Development, and Sustainment Network with all of the major maintenance, repair, and overhaul shops, MROs, in India to develop additional capability in India across heavy maintenance, across component repair, and then of course you've seen engine repair coming up in India. That will reduce the import bill for India as self-reliance increases in services. Right. And then of course as India becomes part of the global supply chain for civil aviation and defense, you will see India's exports also increase on that side. Currently $1.5 billion a year of defense and civil aviation aerospace exports. There is an opportunity to get that up over $5 billion this decade. And we are, of course, about 35 to 40% of the current total. As Boeing, we expect to be a large player in that space as well.
Right. If I were to ask you about some of your suggestions to the government in terms of increasing local manufacturing, reducing reliance on imports, of course it has to be a long-term roadmap. What would some of those suggestions be?
Well, first and foremost, it starts with capability. And I call that end-to-end capability. So what our journey in manufacturing for Boeing in India, we've gone from $250 million of sourcing to over $1 billion of sourcing over the last few years. That's every single year, and almost all of that is for export. So we're talking about over 8,000 crores now. Now, the reason that is so important is because we've gone from simple parts, machine parts, up to complex assemblies and working with advanced materials like composites. That journey is the key. To increase manufacturing in India, you have to build that capability step by step by step. You have to build the overall ecosystem. You have to build clusters of capability like what you're seeing in Nagpur, like what you're seeing in Bangalore, like what you're seeing in Hyderabad, like what we are helping to build in some of the defense corridors. That is what you have to do. And then over time, you can get up to things like final assembly, and you have an end-to-end ecosystem to ultimately build and develop your own platforms. Right. So that step-by-step approach that we're taking is what we would hope all participants in the space take, and that's what's going to allow this sector to grow and meet the government's goals.
Right. What can the budget do for the airline industry right now, for the aviation sector, especially when it comes to the goal of reducing imports?
Well, I'll come to reducing imports in a moment, but the first thing that we always talk about at budget time for the airlines is India has some of the highest ATF, the air turbine fuel prices in the world. That's largely due to the tax regime on aviation fuel. And if that can be rationalized, that will give a huge fillip to the airline industry. This is something that is well known that the ministry is working on. The Honorable Minister of Civil Aviation has been working at the state levels to try to pull states into a commitment to reduce those taxes. Pulling that into GST would be the next big step to making India's airline industry more competitive and profitable and sustainable for the long term. I would think beyond that, I'll again start with the services side of things to make sure that MRO in India is competitive, not just for the Indian market, but potentially for regional and global markets. Adjusting some of the customs duties and making sure that those are competitive with global MRO centers like Dubai and Singapore will also go a long way to success there. And then finally on manufacturing, I think similar to some of the smaller scale PLIs that we've seen on UAVs and drones, there's a broader opportunity for PLI for aerospace manufacturing, which is a dialogue that we're having with industry. I chair the CII Aerospace Committee. That is a big part of the discussion there with the various ministries of commerce, defense, and civil aviation. It might not happen in time for budget this year, but that is a discussion that we will continue throughout this fiscal year and next fiscal year to drive that forward, because we think that can push Indian aerospace manufacturing from that $1.5 billion level that I talked about up to the $5 billion goal and beyond.
I also caught up with Boeing's Vice President for Global Sustainability Policy and Partnerships, Brian Moran, and began by asking him about Boeing's progress on its commitment of delivering 100% of SAF-compliant aircraft by 2030.
Sustainable aviation fuels, or SAF, are vital to decarbonizing aerospace, and that's why we made that commitment last year to make sure that every one of our airplanes by 2030 is 100% SAF compliant. You know, if you go back in 2018, we already flew a 777 freighter on 100% SAF. We were the first to do so. And now it's really two things. It's about working on the airplane itself, on the fuel system, and also in parallel on the fuels to make sure that by 2030 we'll get there. We're making great progress, working on the standards, working on the technology, working with our partners, and I'm very optimistic that we'll get there plenty of time.
Rollout of such aircraft, what will be the conditions necessary for the rollout of these aircraft commercially across the world?
Well, we need enough SAF. That's really it. I think I'm very confident in technology. We've been de-risking and working on sustainable aviation fuels for more than a decade and a half. From the first flight in 2008 to getting 7 different pathways certified now, to, as I said, flying for the first time on 100% SAF. Now it's really about scaling it. This is not a technical problem. This is a policy opportunity and an industrial scaling opportunity. And that's why I'm really excited here in India, talking to some of our partners and the regulators about how do we do that? How do we do that together to scale SAF to where we need it to be by 2030?
Okay. So India currently is considering ways to mandate blending of jet fuel with SAF. What should be the roadmap for that as per global practices?
Yeah, but I think you first need to take a step back and look at the SAF potential here in India. You know, together with the World Economic Forum, we supported a study last year that looked at the potential for SAF, and I'm pleased to say there's enormous opportunity here in India for India to become self-reliant, to produce SAF for its own domestic use at scale. A couple of reasons for that. One is the abundance of feedstock. There's over 160 million tons of feedstock that you need for whether it's municipal solid waste, agricultural residues, but all the way up to renewable energy as well for some of the more advanced fuels. So the feedstock is here, but we got to get it in the right places. And some of that has to do with policy incentives. So the government has a really important role to play, and that gets to what you're talking about. Mandates are one option, and it's a viable option. What we've seen work really well, for instance, in the United States, are incentives. And that's to help bring that price differential between jet fuel and sustainable aviation fuel down, that green premium, as we like to call it. And mandates, again, can accelerate the uptake. But as I said, it's an industrial scaling challenge. And what we often see is that having the right incentives in the right places for a period of time can accelerate bring that S-curve down.
Tax concessions, maybe.
Tax concessions, there are in the United States, for instance, we have what's called a blender's tax credit. It's an incentive of about $1.25 to $1.75, depending on the carbon intensity of the fuel. that blenders can tap into to bring that green premium down. There's other mechanisms that are in place, but let's say, look, scaling SAF is energy intensive, is capital intensive, so the government can help buffer that.
You're investing heavily in autonomous electric flight as well, $450 million according to your last report. Give us a sense that when we speak about reducing emissions in the aviation industry, what are the key pillars of your strategy or key technologies that you're testing, working towards rolling out in the next couple of years?
Yeah, great question. Look, we really look at 4 different pillars, 4 strategies, and it starts with fleet renewal, right? It wouldn't surprise you that as an OEM, building the most efficient airplanes that we possibly can, where every generation delivers 15 to 25% more fuel efficiency. That's our number 1 priority. Look at a market like India growing at about 7%, 2,200 airplanes needed over the next 20 years. Airlines have a lot of opportunity by replacing some of the older airplanes with new aircraft, more efficient aircraft. So fleet renewal is strategy number 1. The second is about operational efficiency. As the skies get more crowded, think of it like a traffic congestion. Flying more direct routes, having continuous descent arrival. So rather than a start-stop approach into an airport where you unnecessarily burn fuel, how do you do that more efficiently? And using the digital capabilities that are already in the airplanes and using that in the airspace is pillar number 2. Pillar number 3 is about renewable energy, and this is where sustainable aviation fuels come in. We talked already about it, but SAFs are between 50 and 80% lower CO2. You can go higher if you use renewable electricity to produce power to liquid fuels as an example, and you capture the carbon. But SAF is really, no matter which study you look at, SAF will contribute between 50 and 75% of our decarbonization journey over the next 20 years. And then our 4th strategy, and you alluded to it, is advanced technology. Look, we're a technology company. That's why we're investing in a joint venture like Wisk, where our eVTOL vehicle, which will be battery electric, which will be autonomous, and that's why we're investing in those spaces, and we're learning. We're learning about autonomy, we're learning about battery density and how that may scale over time. What we do know is that both electricity and some of the hydrogen application are not going to decarbonize the vast majority of the emissions. 70% of the emissions are happening sort of in the 1,500 kilometer range or above. Battery technology and hydrogen will not play in that field. That's why we have a strategy that we refer to as SAF and. It's SAF at the foundation. And yes, we're investing in electric. And yes, we're investing in hydrogen. And on the topic of hydrogen, we're very proud of our learnings there. In 2012, we flew a 2-seat airplane, the first time a human being was ever flown on hydrogen technology. And since then, we've learned through different applications. But when you look at advanced technologies, we have sort of a circle that we follow through. First, we look at the technology itself. Can you get it safely certified? And once you look at the technology and the certification, you then ask yourself, does it actually make business sense for the airlines and our customers? Will this fit into their network? And then finally, what is the total climate impact of that solution? Because 0 emissions at the tailpipe does not mean that the life cycle of that fuel or that energy is actually sustainable. So that's the circle we follow when we look at advanced technology, and it informs our product strategy.
All right, that was Boeing's vice president urging India to consider incentives, including tax concessions, when it comes to boosting the availability of SAF fuels and also increasing sustainability in the aviation industry in India. Moving on to an important